Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Alan Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep.
Here we are with the Q&A with Lara from marketing. Hi, Lara.
Hi, Lara.
Hey, how's it?
Another Q&A. What have you got for us today?
Well, we've got a question from Tomo at Marshall Farm. Why does my property struggle to grow good white clover?
Interesting.
Why does your property?
Thanks, that's right. I think there's a couple of factors here. There's probably more than these, but these are the ones that come to mind. First of all, we've actually known for a while that we've actually been quite low on sulphur. And you'll be able to tell the listeners how important sulphur is for clover growth.
Very important.
Well, thanks for that. And so we've been trying to remedy that, but it's taking a little time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think we've been hit by clover root weevil. So that's had added pressure.
Yeah. So that just context, that's for other listeners from out of the country. We've every time a pest arrives in New Zealand, it often finds it's an amazing place to be and it explodes. And one of the nasty little pests that arrived about nearly 15 to 20 years ago now was an insect, a weevil that feeds on the roots of our clover plants. And originally it decimated our landscape, and now it's got a natural biocontrol, which we've imported into New Zealand to take the top off the populations. But the issue with biological controls is that the little wasps that target the root weevil do not always keep up, and therefore you can go for windows of time when the weevil gets ahead of the parasitoid, and the parasitoid is 2 to 3 months behind. In that time, you can have your clover stripped out of your pasture, and it takes a little bit of time for it to come back.
Yeah, so I think we've probably gone through that wave, and we're on our way back. But that's some of the reason. Thanks, Tomo, for bringing that up.
Yep.
So someone that maybe is listening to this right now and they're like, I'm kind of having that problem, or might think they do. What should they be looking out for?
Well, obviously the key indicator for that would be that there'll be under expectation of clover in your pasture. So a couple of other things that may be at play is that you need to just check your baseline pHs and phosphate levels, both which are very important for clover growth. Something that in the New Zealand soil landscape, a lot of our soils naturally release potassium and is naturally weathered out of our soils, and quite often that means that we don't rush to put potassium fertilizers on. They tend to be quite expensive styles of fertilizer as well, but they are extremely effective at supporting clover development and clover growth. So you tend to find sulfur and potassium, and molybdenum as a micronutrient and boron as a micronutrient are both quite important for legume development. Now, if you don't have a lot of clover, the other thing is looking at broadcasting to put desirable cultivars or leaf sizes of clover back in. And also in the presence of clover root weevil, you may consider pivoting a little bit and putting some red clover back into your pasture via broadcasting.
Because it's a little bit more robust against the root weevil.
It's got hairier leaves, it's less palatable to the root weevil, and it's got a bigger taproot to start with. So it's much, much harder to aggressively for the larvae underground to chew off all the roots.
Good question, Tomo.
Yeah, nice tips. And what sport should feature in the Olympics? Agricultural edition.
Well, I think having a little bit of affinity for the south of New Zealand, I would say Swede put.
All right, so you're going to throw some Swedes around.
We are throwing. No, we don't need to throw gumboots. We're throwing Swedes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there is one already in the Olympics, and that's a hammer throw because you've got a hammer. Yeah. So that's probably mine.
Oh. It's weak. It's weak, Juddy.
Wonderful. If you have any questions, technical, serious, lighthearted, or anything in between, please get in touch at info@agricom.co.nz or our socials. The Alan Juddy Show has a Facebook page now, so flick it a like, flick us a question, and we'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Lara.
Oh, g'day there, Alistair. Good to see you. Your eyes are looking pretty green today.
Dodgy.
No. Do you know eyes and dad jokes have got something in common?
No.
The cornier, the better. Anyway, what are we gonna talk about today?
Glenn, after I recover from that, we're gonna discuss how to choose which summer brassica to sow.
Well, that sounds all very boring after that start. But anyway, so what are we going to cover? What are the things we're going to talk about?
Well, what we'll cover is what we're looking to do is give a little bit of a decision-making process for choosing your summer brassica and summer feed choices. And by doing this, we're just going into a little bit of a deep dive into the very subtle but relevant differences between all the summer feed options, because actually once you have them clear, often your aims can very clearly send you down the pathway of which one to use.
Yeah, because often we put those in because we put them in last year.
Yep.
And sometimes if we think through some of the things we're going to talk about today, we might have made some different choices. So, and being aware of those, I think, is really important. So, some of the factors that let's first of all define why would we be putting in a summer crop?
Yes. So at the highest level, summer cropping is an opportunity for farmers around the world actually to utilise spring moisture and carry that spring moisture forward into a dry summer environment, utilising the ability of particularly brassica crops to be established in mid-spring to late spring conditions, having an element of tolerance to early summer conditions, in fact growing very, very strongly during that first phase of summer, and then presenting feed in a really high quality and nutritional profile when the rest of the landscape is deteriorating and turning brown, basically, and livestock performance starts to plummet.
And of course, the other part of this is it also gives another chance in terms of a full pasture renovation program.
Correct, and that's the key again to summer cropping, is that it gives you an opportunity to pick some of your poorest performing pastures and locations on your property and identify what's wrong with them by soil testing, using a spade to dig around to identify compaction or drainage issues, and then recognise that we can actually go through a pasture renovation phase, but in that process, we can capture a highly nutritious standing summer crop to actually make our animals fly in quite a difficult time of year.
Cool. So I think the way we might structure this podcast is we'll run through some of the factors that we should be thinking about. And then I think we should pick on the broad groupings of those crops and discuss those factors and how they impact on those individual products.
Yeah, I think that would be right. But if we can keep in the back of our minds is that what is really cool is to try and work out how each one of these, say, key influences like climate, soil, fertility, timing of grazing creates a decision path where there might be more than one answer. But as long as you know the traits of those varieties, you can start to form your own decision tree about, what am I going to have to think about based on a certain set of timings.
And then I thought at the end, we should run through a few scenarios. So I thought I'd give you the scenario and then you could articulate the thought process about which crop you could use. Perfect. So in terms of the factors that the key factors that will influence what crop we put in, I guess let's talk about some of the physical features of the farm. One will be rainfall.
Yes.
And so are we talking about total rainfall, or is it really in the time when the crop's growing?
The only thing that matters is in the time when the crop is growing. You can be in the driest landscape in the world, and a lot of our listeners in Australia would appreciate this, is that you can have a terribly, terribly dry autumn. In fact, just like this year and a big chunk of Victoria and New South Wales, you can have a very, very dry autumn, very, very dry winter. But as long as the soil is full, at one point in late winter and early spring, you can convert to a summer crop. And so I think that's what we're seeing and experiencing over there in Australia just this year is a good example of that, is that you only need a little bit of rain at the right time to charge your soil at the right time to convert it to a summer feed platform.
Yep. Soil fertility is another focus.
Oh no! Look, before we leave the rainfall, and total moisture regime, it's still a massive point of defining which decision tree pathway you might consider to go down. The key to rainfall is that the rape species particularly are much more tolerant of semi-arid conditions, hot, dry and free draining environments. And so we have a little bit of conflict in New Zealand and the use of summer crop, particularly the rapes, is that quite regularly we have gone through periods of dry as climate change kicks in and we get more variability and wetter locations go through periods of summer dry. The reality is the harder the summer conditions, the more suitable rapes are as your primary choice, forage rapes, as your primary choices. But if it's a high rainfall environment, a little bit of extra humidity, slightly more organic soils because of the historically long, higher rainfall environment, you can suddenly see these rapes fail to meet their maturity or ripening levels because actually they're planted in an environment, although dry, is actually total rainfall is quite high and you can get rain and they may not mature and they may keep growing beyond their windows. So understanding just that is quite important. The difference in, are you a naturally dry environment almost on the point of being semi-arid, or are you actually a true temperate landscape where your rainfall is actually quite high, but just recently you've had some dry seasons.
Yeah, and
it's
I've
quite
seen
a big deal.
Yeah,
it's quite a big deal.
And I think just to follow on from that ripening, if we're not getting into that ripening phase, that does lead to some animal health
Absolutely.
and productivity issues.
And to be fair, I've just described the difference between falling in towards the shorter term leafy turnip versus the rape, which is much more suited to an environment where you may get summer rain and you've got a fertile soil.
Yeah. So moving on to fertility, when we talk about soil fertility, are we talking about some key macro elements, or what's your definition of fertility?
Oh, look, the brassicas are typically used as a pasture improvement tool. So as we discussed at the start, a crop on the way to improving your paddock or your landscape. And in doing that, we are tending to go into our lower fertility or problematic paddocks. So we've got a couple of real drivers to understand that from a soil fertility. But at the heart and soul of it, they like an okay pH. They like, dare I say it, okay to good pH. They like a decent amount of phosphate because they are, at all intents and purposes, a horticultural brassica, and they tend to thrive with good phosphate levels. And the total amount of greenery you grow in a calendar year is still proportionate to the access to nitrogen, because everything that's green is driven by nitrogen to achieve that. So, crude protein in a brown summer, having a green plant full of crude protein is still defined by how much nitrogen's in your landscape. So I've just mentioned pH, phosphate, nitrogen, and in the shorter term summer cropping zones, they're probably still right up there as the key drivers.
Cool. And then the other thing that are some of the key factors that influence that choice are around the timing of feed. So give me a flavour of what we mean by timing of feed.
Well, again, timing's really important because they are a brassica, and if the temperature is warm and rising and day length's already rising, their ability to germinate and physically grow fast from the day they germinate is really, really high. Our problem across many different landscapes is that we can get lulled into thinking that sowing earlier is better. And what we will see constantly is that actually the temperature and the day length dominate, and the dates of sowing some of these crops based on your region are pretty consistent. And just because you have a stint of better weather doesn't mean you should change what you have known is the fastest, most successful establishment window. So that's a big deal. But really at the heart and soul of it, hot, dry locations that can get hot in the end of spring and are warm coming out of winter have a chance to sow earlier than most. And that is defined by the fact that by the end of spring, they are already genuinely hot and dry. We've got a couple of places on the east coast of New Zealand that would represent a place you would sow early. Australia would be a wonderful example, southern New South Wales on the slopes and part of the warmer parts of New South Wales. You would go very early to get there before the temperature is overwhelming. And so there's a few examples where you sow early, but for the rest of them, you get to know their maturity, and that is the time frame where they're ready to be grazed or they have the most minimal risk of any animal health issues. And you count back from that date, or you target the choice of brassica based on the sowing window that is most appropriate for you.
All right. So the timing of that will come. There'll be a part of the decision. I guess the other two that are probably aren't very high on the priority list, but there needs to be some consideration would be the stock class that you put on that.
Yeah. So really, at the end of the day, it's for the sheep industry, it's lambs. 9 times out of 10 at the start of summer, it's lambs. At the end of the summer, it might be skinny ewes or what we call ewe hoggets, which are ewe lambs. Basically, we're trying to grow out to weight or possibly even mate in the first autumn. And so they get to use the brassicas on the second half of their cycle and the regrowth cycle at the end of summer and possibly even very early autumn. However, at the start, we tend to find they're loaded with lambs, and the key to your decision process of what brassica you would use is defined by your farm system. And what you are looking to is transition out of a weaning phase with minimal time on declining pasture quality and grasses, which are often leading into the first weeks of summer are starting to decline quite fast. And you identify when your non-sellable lambs or lambs that are not to weight are ready to go on to crop, and then you would identify what crop will get you there in that time frame. So for some of them, it's 55 days from sowing, which will get you just before Christmas. For some, there's 75 days post-sowing, and that will get you near the end of January. And then you've got your bigger yielding 90-day type products that would be looking at the middle of January to the the middle of January would be when you'd like to start those. So it's not worth putting a brassica in if your stock are sitting there loading up on L3 larvae through summer on brown grass and they're already starting to go backwards. You tend to find you want the brassica fit for when the lambs are physically there, and so they don't have to spend any time on declined quality, summer quality of pasture.
And then probably the last factor that I'll throw in there is really around method of feeding, and probably not a large one because I think mostly, but we can fit that around the crop. But I'm probably trying to say there is in the regrowth products, you get the best out of them if you're in a rotation. Yeah, correct. I
just with the stock cluster, I just use the lamb job on a multi-graze brassica as a standard point. But if that was cattle or if that was dairy cows we would be putting them up behind a wire, and quite regularly it would be a single grazing with no regrowth. And so there's a number of different traits. But if I was to describe the techniques that I see is probably the majority of people do a set stocking method of feeding because of scale and the non-desire to move fences. We would often recommend establishing a rotation by splitting paddocks either in half or quarters, large amount of feed. So there's a feeders there and each break would be a 7-day break, or just trying to coordinate more than one paddock to create a rotation. With cattle, on average, you could get away with doing the same on young cattle, but more often than not, they're behind a wire and we're actually grazing across paddocks. And if you're wanting a regrowth phase, you would then be sticking a wire up behind them to achieve the regrowth. So they're the traditional styles that we recommend or that are practiced, set stocking, but actually does conform to a rotation because you try to set stock for 10, 15 to 20 days and then rotate onto another paddock. Yeah.
So let's start talking about products now. So we've talked about those key factors which are influencing the choice. Let's go to turnips first, and there's probably two styles of turnips.
Yeah,
we've
absolutely.
got the leaf turnip and then the bulb turnip. So let's just in terms of the decision, if we were going to turnips, what are the key factors in terms of making that decision?
Well, I think it's black and white when it really comes to the leafy turnips, and our variety Hunter is actually a really, really good example of a regrowth leafy turnip, and then a traditional tankered summer bulb turnip. They're very different in the styles they are, and should be separated really early on. Mm-hmm. And I'll probably start by addressing the bulb turnip, the summer turnip, and it's really defined as a protein source for summer, but for environments with moderately defined shorter summer periods, because they don't hold forever. And why people like the stubble turnips, as they used to be called, but summer turnips, is that technically they're put in to be a protein source through summer, but summer can be such a negative time for holding leaf, particularly with insect pests and just severe temperature or even humidity. Leaf can actually dissolve. So having a bulb means that you've still got a high energy feed source there for the period of time that the bulb is functional for grazing. The issue with turnips is that the bulb's functionality for grazing does come to an end as it becomes almost like dehydrated through summer periods, and also almost goes rubbery before, if you carry it for too long. And in doing that, you tend to find your cattle tend to kick it around like soccer balls more so than eat it. So remembering initially putting a summer turnip in for a single grazing and a pasture renovation thing would be defined by a summer environment that's very defined. Typically the month of February, maybe mid to late January to February, which is the middle to the end of summer, but no longer than the end of summer. And then if you require more after that, actually bulb turnip isn't the right crop.
And do they need some reasonable fertility?
They need good fertility. They're designed for a good fertility environment, and technically what will be a high rainfall zone. So very rarely do summer turnips go into a truly low rainfall environment. Turnips aren't really the ideal for hot, low rainfall environments.
And there's no regrowth here or a single crop. And I'd say
I like them because they're simplistic. You rotationally graze across them with a break fence, which is pretty simple to function at. You allocate them based on the amount in the diet. It might be 1/3 of a dairy cow's diet, as an example. And when you're finished, you are finished. There is no decisions. The paddock is fallow. It is ready to be sprayed for weeds and then resown on new pastures as soon as the fall or autumn allows you to.
So great place to start. In terms of the leafy turnip, talk to me about how you would use that.
Well, for me, the leafy turnip is the regrowth brassica for the slightly higher rainfall zones. And by that I mean you get the best for animal performance and the best for functionality out of a nice hot, dry summer. It goes extremely well. However, it is still designed for a slightly higher rainfall location, and in summer conditions that may pick up 20 to 30 mils every month.
In deeper soils? So
deeper and more fertile soils.
But water holding capacity as well?
All of the above. So the real key to the leaf turnip is that it must be grazed early, because it does go off, and the further and further you allow it to develop, the more bitter it becomes. The animals should still be eating it. They just don't want to eat it. The quality is still exceptional and their performance will be amazing, but they will just not want to eat it once it gets past a certain point.
We had a rule of thumb, particularly with the Hunter product, that you really needed to be getting animals onto that within 55 days.
Yep. Or 22 to 24 centimetres.
Yeah, so because after that, just physically getting them on was really difficult.
Correct.
So
shut the gate and make them eat it. And the key to, and I know that's not ideal, but for summer and the time you need to get things moving, you got to remember everything they'll get to choose outside that gate is so much worse for them than actually just getting them to eat that brassica and adapt to it fast.
And the other thing I'd say is, and I think we've covered this in previous podcasts, particularly for something like Hunter, I'm a real fan of rotational grazing, because what I want them to do is not only just pick at leaf, but actually start eating some of that petiole. Yeah. And that's a slightly more balance in terms of protein to energy ratios. And you can really get them, force them into grazing that, because as you rightfully say, it is the last thing on the preference scale.
Once it gets past a certain height, once it's past 25 centimetres and carrying on and growing up to knee height, it's just a really tough day at the office to get animals to eat it.
So being able to get them on a rotation, I think, is really important.
Not wanting to leave that, it's really important with a regrowth crop like leaf turnip, where its apical growing point is at the base of the crown, is that the key to rotational graze versus set stocking, we've always identified that typically when animals are adapted on leafy turnip, the animal's performance is defined by your allocation, your intake, and how much you ask them to eat. And then when you go and look at the maths and the success of a leafy turnip from an economic perspective, it is solely driven by how much you grow. The animals almost look after themselves. So it's actually about the agronomic principles of eating what's there and then getting off it and allowing it all to regrow. Because what happens with set stocking is if you put them in there for too long, they start to eat the young leaves that are unfurling before those leaves have efficiently grown out into the potential dry matter mass that they could have. And so basically you're eating your future growth in set stocking. And then if you get your utilization wrong, you start chipping bulbs and losing plants. And that then also collapses your population and regrowth.
Yeah, it was really interesting when we've done a little bit of work where we've essentially set stocked a paddock to eat through, let's say, over 60 days. And then what we've done is we've taken exactly the same stocking rate and put them on a rotation. And interestingly enough, as you rightfully say, because you're reducing the leaf area of the whole crop as you set stock, our calculations would say you lose in the vicinity of 20% productivity at the end of that exercise simply by not allowing that regrowth. There's a little bit of regrowth, but it's not nearly as much as you are when you're in rotation.
And that's so important because the cost of putting the crop in is the same. But for the sake of a 4-way electric fence creating 4 cells, the difference of 20% carrying capacity is actually a really big deal.
Yeah, I agree.
Really
I agree.
Big deal.
Okay, so leaf turnips, we're going to come to a decision till there.
Slightly wetter summers, slightly better fertility. If you have a chance of having a wetter summer, turnips are still the plants for you. And bulb turnips and leaf turnips are two very different things.
Thanks. Right, moving on to, and I'm going to frame this up by going, we've got a slightly more longer and drier summer. We probably move out of the turnip species into our forage rape. So describe the two different forage rapes that we've got.
So what we've basically got is a relatively nice defined industry selection style, in that we've got what you could describe as low yielding rapes and high yielding rapes, because by that definition, the point being is the low yielding rape you can give it more days and it won't necessarily convert more yield. Whereas the high yielding rapes tend to take those extra days and just grow more. And the point being is it's at that sort of so-called ceiling yield. Now, this is where climatic conditions really mess with us, but it's at that ceiling yield in a dry East Coast that you identify the window that might be safest for grazing from issues of photosensitivity. And we describe that as ripening, but it's also mixed up in the terminology of maturity. I personally link the ripening to the animal health risk and the maturity to when I stop growing. And so if you sow rapes in a too wetter environment in the wrong humidity zone, the maturity doesn't matter. It just won't stop growing.
Yeah.
The $1 million question, does it ripen?
Yeah. And so I think that's a really important point, because often we interchange those two terms.
Yeah.
Where
I've never been able to actually separate them in real terms, but they have a subtle difference in my mind.
Yeah, but I think you're right. One's to dealing with the issues from an animal health point of view,
correct,
like photosensitivity. But the other one is really the
and that's the ripening, by the way.
Yeah, and the maturity is going, when do I get to a point where, regardless of new growth, I've sort of hit a ceiling yield?
Correct.
And I think that really interesting that they may coincide, but they may not.
Correct.
So I think that's a really important
I've never been able to
terminology.
unpack that satisfactorily, but I don't think one word covers both of those things and gives it credit. And but coming back to the 75 dayers, the earlier maturity types, they are lovely products. Some of them go super well, but what they excel at is this concept that, they're all sown at the same time. And if you require animals for grazing in January, you need the 75-dayer, because the reality is, you're going to have another 20 days without your rape being ready to be grazed if you put a 90-dayer in, and you need lambs on a paddock at the start of January, as an example, middle of summer. So understanding that and when your animal's requirements are helps you define how early the maturity is and what group of products you're looking at. Then the second thing to recognise is if you graze them early, you give them more time to regrow.
So these are the regrowth varieties, yep.
So they're not the regrowth varieties, because this is my point. The 90-day products have some wonderful regrowth traits as well. It's not about whether they're more regrowth types or not. It's about, if I start early, I have more time to regrow. If I start late with a 90-day plus rape and it takes me a long time to graze the volume I've got there, I have now less time to regrow in the autumn. So often with the 90-day rapes, you see them being grazed once, maybe twice, but very hard to get a third or fourth grazing out of because you run out of time. With the 75-day rapes, you start early, gives you more time to get another regrowth and more time to get another regrowth after that.
And so they are typically at home in slightly more drier situations?
Yeah, traditionally on free draining light soils, which you would almost go right through to the point of calling them semi-arid. So we're still harvesting moisture, taking it into summer. In the Australian model, you have scale and scope on your side, not necessarily high stocking rates. Often in dry environments, they become quite spatial in the regrowth. So plants die. You've got singular, more robust plants that continue for longer. In the New Zealand model, we're not really burning our plants out of this landscape. So most of them stay alive, pick up 30 mils sometime in mid to late summer, and boom, they kick off all over again. So that's the sort of model we're working with. Free draining, lighter soils.
Soil fertility?
Same story, often a little bit lower in the rapes because of the landscapes they're going into aren't the high-end productive environments of the higher natural rainfall zones. But the reality is, we're feeding them to improve a paddock. We're feeding them for their spring accumulation potential. So you're feeding them up front. They're all being treated relatively equally as far as our cropping fertility starter fertilizer is. So you give yourself the best chance to set your hay shed up going into a hot, dry summer.
So I guess that's a really important point, because what we're saying is they are able to cope with a slightly lower fertility. That's not to say that we reduce our fertilizer and expect them. Yeah. So that's
just
really
the background fertility might be at a lower level to start with, but our starting nutrient program is designed to meet the crop's immediate needs to achieve successful economic yields.
Yeah. In terms of, stock classes, again, I guess it's that timing, when stock's coming on.
Absolutely.
I can think of, you're right, if you've got lambs coming early, then you can't afford to have one of these
something too late,
later maturing. Yeah. If you don't have any stock on board until quite late in the piece, then actually you could take advantage of these larger yields from the later grazing.
And often those larger yields are also pretty complementary to cattle systems as well, where you may not get a second grazing. Yeah. It just feeds you into an autumn resowing program.
Yeah. So one of the, and this has been, there's been some recent developments in the next species I want to talk to, and that's kale. So talk to me a little bit about how we're using kale as a summer feed now.
Well, this is the one that sort of deserves to have those terminologies that I suggested exist, is that it's a late maturity species, but with no ripening requirements. So in other words, it's put in for a very long season cropping system, so sown in mid to late spring, but not eaten until the start of winter. So you're talking about a long maturity window to reach peak yields. And most of its yielding, even though it's sown in that window I've described, most of its productivity doesn't occur until the autumn or the fall. So it actually grows a lot late and keeps pushing on into winter. However, what we've identified is that, it's been used for a number of years where young lambs have been set stocked at very low levels inside a potential winter feed crop. They've taken off leaf and maybe a little bit of PDO and then taken out before they've done too much damage to any stems, for example, on the kale, and then it's shut up and let to move forward in its winter crop. A sort of a new view on that is utilising the kale literally like a rape, considering it as a 90-day rape, but it could be earlier than that, and identifying the fact that we will be grazing it as if it's a standing rape crop, possibly with a desire for one regrowth cycle, or just graze once and go into your autumn sowing system, for example, dropping in an Italian ryegrass, direct drilling through the regrowth. So that system, what's changed and what that opportunity gives us is that if you need feed, you can graze that kale at literally any height. It could be 1 foot high. And if you need it, regardless of its economic return, you need it. If you don't need it, you let it grow out. And then if you suddenly need it when it's knee height or thigh height, and that's its primary window of time, where you graze it as if it's a one graze rape. The real trick to it, though, is that if you don't need it because suddenly your climate actually goes wet, you can carry that forward as part of your autumn or winter feed program. And so that creates a level of flexibility that a rape can't do, because the rape would be very old, very unpalatable, and may even go to flower if it's left ungrazed for that amount of time, which is like 140 to 180 days.
Yeah, I just see this has got flexibility written all over it.
It's something that's highly attractive today, is something that has multiple options.
But I think that's got to be tempered with the fact that if you know you're going to use that, at day 70, the rape will still give you
a better job.
It's just that if you didn't quite know whether you were going to use it or not, or you're in an environment where you can't pick this summer, it could be wet, it could be dry, I don't know. This seems to be a pretty good option in terms of covering more bases, not quite as well, but at least more bases.
Yeah, look, if you're putting 40 hectares of summer crop in, this is definitely a good option for putting the last 10 hectares of that 40 hectares into kale that is designed to be grazed at the end of that cycle. And if you don't need it because of climatic conditions, you roll it into another program. So no other brassica holds like that. So that's quite a big deal.
Right. So now that we've sort of been through that, the other key ones, I guess one other thing that we probably should cover is, so we've talked about those the brassica crops. Just very quickly, is there anything outside of brassicas that can do a similar job which aren't strictly brassicas?
Yeah, good question. And for the dairy sector, remember what I've said about summer turnips are really well defined for a defined summer cropping window. So you're saying this is a defined summer period at maybe 4 to 5 weeks. Summer turnips tick that box incredibly well for large cattle systems, but particularly dairy. So protein source in a dry dairy environment that may only be dry for 4 to 5 weeks. The issue we're faced with the elements of changing landscape, changing climate, is that some of those summers that once upon a time were only four weeks long are now 8 weeks to 12 weeks long, and turnips do not cover that whole window of time. And in New Zealand, what's happened here is that in the dairy sector, we've identified that although chicory cannot create 10 tonne at first grazing, it can be multi-grazed many times and actually only tends to get stronger in the second half of summer, to the point where when we're actually trying to move it on into another rotation, we actually probably have to use chemical to suppress it. It's going so well by the end of autumn. So technically, the greater the risk of longer summers, the more relevant chicory is instead of bulb turnip. After that, you step out and chicory has a place to play on many East Coast scenarios. It tends to be better for floodplains or heavy soils, and those same East Coast, semi-arid to really hot, dry summers. The heavier the soil, the better the soil, the longer it will perform. However, the more you have to manage it to get it through to a second year. So heavy soils tend to be very wet in winter, and that is not a good thing for maintaining chicory into a second or third year.
And I think the other thing about chicory is if you are going into a second year, the first year is also always very nice because we don't have any of that reproductive growth. But the second year, I think where I've seen good use of this is you've actively got to manage that stem.
Stem. And you've got to have the stock classes available to unleash on the emerging stem in the second spring. So that's something we'll discuss again in the future. Other crops really, so the chicory is the one that can transfer into some of the leaf turnip area. I would say leaf turnip and chicory also cover the same soil types. And then the chicory does also morph into some of the rape country as well, but not necessarily as successfully as, for example, lucerne. Then I would say the other of the crops that are highly relevant in the sheep industry is red clover. But again, it's a match-up alternative to leaf turnip, more so than the rapes, which are slightly drier landscapes. And in the drier landscapes, obviously our plantain has functioned as a cropping system, but to be fair, it's not its strong point summer. It tends to be the lactation feed in a dry environment where you have no lambs left. Yeah. So you're not worried about finishing in a dry climate. You're just dealing with hoggets and light ewes because you've actually sold in a store market your lambs in a dry environment. But plantain plays a role in getting more lambs away off mum prime, so you're not exposed to the store market. So plantain doesn't really fit the same summer cropping discussion as red clover or chicory.
Cool. So probably now what we should do is just run through a couple of scenarios, and I want you to articulate sort of the thought process of how you arrive at what you'd recommend for these scenarios. So the first one, I'm in a real summer dry environment. I know that's going to go for quite some periods, and I'm really all about finishing lambs. So I've got a few ewes, but I'm all about finishing lambs, and it's all about as many lambs as I can get through there. What's the thought process going through that?
Oh, well, you've just described quite long summer dry. I don't know, but 9 times out of 10, those same environments can end up lambing quite early. So I'm predicting that you're going to end up weaning quite early. Again, summer dry, you'll either make a decision to sell in the store market or you'll want to try and carry on, because actually that's not a great place to finish animals in the description you just gave me. So I would probably acknowledge that it's dry, long summer conditions, likelihood because it's dry you've lambed early, and that your lambs will be weaned at the start of summer basically. And that means you're in the zone of looking at hunter or early maturity rapes, 75-day rapes. And because you've just defined your dry, I would also say your 75-day rape is probably the most attractive because you're going to get animals on it early, not long after weaning. And after that, you're going to develop a regrowth cycle, and you're going to try and get as many regrowth cycles as possible because you started grazing earlier. That would be my scenario. I think the only change to that might be the consideration of putting 1/4 of the area into a kale and aiming to graze that at probably knee height to near thigh height, and seeing it as the last part of your rape grazing rotation, using that as a larger standing mass to allow all your other regrowth rape paddocks to get good regrowth in them. And that would be the only other scenario I'd offer there.
Yeah, so okay, let's say we've got and that's great. Let's say we're in that same property, so we're really summer dry. If we were really focusing this crop on maybe putting weight on ewes prior to mating now, so maybe we are getting rid of a lot of those lambs early. Maybe we've used plantain to make sure that we
don't have many of them.
We don't have many of them, and so finishing lambs isn't really the focus. But we know that the break in autumn is very unreliable. So, and we're really focused on getting those ewes up to weight for a next lamb crop. What do you recommend?
I'll give you 2 options there.
Excellent.
The first one would be a 90-day rape where you're actually only going to graze once in summer. So you'll use a stock class where you can get a good margin out of. You'll utilise it once and then you'll shut it up for tupping feed, which is mating feed. So you'll utilise its one regrowth cycle because you've used it's taken longer to get to its crop. You're using it in February. You're probably going to take between 20 and 30 days to graze your area, and that's March or what's that? The start of autumn. So you're unlikely to get much more than 30 or 40 days before your mating requirement is there. So I'd typically go for a 90-day rape with a 1 regrowth cycle that you're going to tup on. The addition to that, though, would be using a 75-day rape and actually putting something like our plantain in it, which we said wasn't great in summer but is magical in autumn, and in conjunction with a regrowth brassica, combined, they work very, very well in that first regrowth autumn. So 75-day rape, you're starting to graze it early. The plantain doesn't make up a large part of the diet at that point of time, very, very small part. But in the second regrowth, maybe the third regrowth, you're shutting up for tupping feed. By the third regrowth, the plantain will actually be actively contributing to that autumn regrowth that you're going to be mating on.
And just to highlight, I think, you look at these systems and say they, sometimes they're not a cheap system, but when you realise that if that feed is able to generate more lambs per ewe, that is essentially driving your productivity.
Well, you've got two big drivers. One, you've got a margin that you're picking up off your animals that would have been sold store, and that you're vulnerable to the store market, and you made a call to economically take control of that finishing process. You also recognise you're no longer as vulnerable to the internal parasite issues that may exist in your property, facial eczema, some of the other nasties that are out there. The crop is a relatively safe place. The part that the modelling never gets easily across is that, remembering, firstly, this is part of a pasture renovation process. So you're heading towards a brand new pasture, but you might be able to take control of the first part of your store market. Some of your heavies, you might just use your heavies to push on and finish them quite fast, get your crop in a regrowth cycle, and then you might find that there for a window of time that your hoggets have done it tough through the season. So your ewe lambs go onto that crop and you start to grow your ewe lambs out. What you also might find is that it empowers you in more success for hogget mating or young ewe lamb mating. And so you might see your percentages move from 90% to 110% because you've got them to a body weight that they're taking the ram, you've got them on a nutritional profile. And then you might also find that you've got enough crop around to put all your late ewes on and get a change in momentum. And so you can't ignore the fact that the hoggets are extra lambs. And if you change your hogget mating by 20 or 30% because you grow them well on crop, that's quite a big economic return. And it means that they're closer to their mature body size by the time they get to lambing as lambs, as end of 1-year-old lambs. And the second part you can't ignore is that the only other way you can manipulate your income in a sheep operation is by having a higher lambing percentages or carrying more sheep. And so the lambing percentage of light ewes, gummy ewes, last lambing ewes, when they're light is quite a big deal to get more lambs in the following spring. So it's pretty powerful in working not just for finishing lambs, which is what most of the maths are driven by.
Yeah, and you often hear this term spiralling up. One thing leads to another, which leads to another, and we tend to see that we're spiraling up. Just to finishing off the scenarios now, if I'm in a summer safe environment, so I'm not getting too hot and I get the odd bit of rain and I'm a lamb finishing system. What's your thought processes going through there?
100% leaf turnip. It's just fast and furious. You can, it's built for exactly what you've described. Any sniff of moisture, it regrows furiously. And it carries on to a fair time if you're not taking out the basal part of the plant, which turns into a bulb with time. If they're not chipping that final bulb that slowly comes out of the ground, plant number survives. You can keep grazing that all the way until you need to finish or direct drill some grasses into it. So leaf turnip first and foremost, but I'd also start to think very carefully about the role of chicory or red clover at that moment, because you can depreciate the cost of it over a couple of years in a situation like you've just described. Probably with red clover being probably the most efficient of them for the lamb the lamb's specific purpose.
So that's a great segue into the last thing I want to talk about, and that was really about not just thinking about when the crop ends, but actually looking at this. And I think you said at the outset, this is another opportunity to get to a new pasture. Thinking about how does the crop end and what's next, and so thinking through it's not just in the cropping phase, but what happens after that.
Well, like I described, if you go to the long maturity crops, the 90 plus day crops, they tend to be grazed once and then set up for a decent regrowth on the second regrowth cycle. And once that's grazed, you're actually quite late in autumn. So your decisions of what you can put into that are quite moderate. And so you're almost hoping for another regrowth phase, or you just carry that regrowth even further into winter. You better hope you picked your right genetics and things for things to hold under those conditions, because you tend to find those regrowth cycles, if they're held in the wrong climatic conditions, bug pressures, humidity, you can see different genetics can fold at that moment. So that's quite a big deal. And so you can see that by understanding the 90-day may be a one graze and then one store, you can work out, well, what am I going to do on that regrowth phase? Am I going to punch some grass in there? So I'm taking a bob each way to get the best out of that moving forward. The multi-graze one, I feel, the one thing I don't like about the leaf turnip, the one thing I don't like about the early maturity rape is actually you have got a lot of decisions to make. You can graze it multiple times. The question is, when you're on a declining potential, when do you make a decision? Yeah. And just because you can carry that regrowth into winter doesn't mean it's economically the best thing you could do. And I can't emphasize enough, I'd be pumping grass into it, into direct drill directly into the third graze regrowth and taking them combined in there, because that gives you the privilege of having not only a winter feed round, but a spring lambing round or a silage round. And I think that creates flexibility and realizing total productivity out of the paddock, that you can't rely on the regrowth to represent what you could have achieved. So just because you get a little bit of regrowth doesn't mean that's what you could have achieved if you made another decision.
Yeah, and the point you make, and you make the point well, that it's about thinking about how does the crop end.
Correct.
Which when
just because you got a bit there doesn't mean it's meaningful.
Yeah, I agree.
And doesn't mean it reflects at all what your potential was through that autumn, winter, and the following spring, when you've got possibly a bare bit of land trying to work out, when can I sow? When can I fill it up? And so what are the weather conditions and all those things? So putting a little bit of annual ryegrass in the autumn, or Italian if you want flexibility, or even a hybrid if you want to eke out a rotation of 2 to 3 years. So all of those things are completely doable in that moment.
So in terms of summary, I think we've covered this. It's been a really good discussion, Alistair. We've certainly talked about summer crops and where they fit. Focus largely on brassica crops, but also given some options that are not brassicas. We've talked about rainfall and soil fertility and the timing of feed and the stock class that we're going to put on them, and also the method of feeding have been key influences. I know you've made a really good point around leaf turnip and bulb turnip and how they are very different, and how we should use those. The same thing with the early and late maturing rape, and I think the description between maturity and ripening, I think you made an excellent point there. The idea that kale will give us some flexibility in terms of if we don't quite know what the outcome's going to be in terms of environment or when we're going to graze that, the kale will give us some options there, and I think it's very flexible. And then just running through those scenarios, I think when you think about when you need feed and what environment you're in, it does really narrow down to only a couple of different choices, and so the field may look wide, but it's not actually that wide when you understand what your requirements are. And then finally, I think it's again a really good point. We shouldn't see this in isolation. We should see this as a crop which is going to transition into something else, or is going to stop and go into something else, but we need to be thinking about the something else.
Yeah, correct. And also not running false economy of taking something just because it's there, thinking that's as good as you can do, when really by making a decision earlier, you are fully utilising your hectares of land and getting the best out of it, and not creating stop moments at the funny time of year, like in August and September, late winter and early spring, when you've got nothing in a paddock.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. As normal, very informative. It's been fantastic. I've just got to go, so we'll see you next time.
See ya, Juddy.